are my 3 books so far. When I was a kid, I used to secretly write poetry in school. And the subject was not poetry, but that's how long it's been and kind of how I got started. This book, maybe shirts are easier, was not expected to be or planned to be a book. My husband passed, and I began to write poetry, which was how I dealt with my grief. 10 years later, after this sat in a file cabinet as sheets of paper at Willowbridge, I thought, it's almost Valentine's Day. I'd like to read a few of those poems. And when I did, people were so touched. A woman came up to me and she said, "Is that a book?" I said, "No." She said, "When it is, I want to get it. That's what is to be a book." I'd like to share, to keep it briefer, what it says on the back of it. Ruth and Bob met when she was 18. They felt their meeting was meant to be, but both of them had a great deal of inner growth to accomplish. After 8 years of marriage, they divorced. In the next 16 years, they did the work it took to grow separately. When they remarried, their gratefulness knew no bounds. They knew how very fortunate they were and lived together with a deep appreciation for having a second chance in life. When Bob died 20 years later, Ruth put her grief into the words that are this book. It's like if you have children who don't have favorites, this is not my favorite, but this is the book that has been meaningful to other people with their grief, and that is meaningful to me. I'd like to read a poem that, of all these poems that he never heard because I wrote them after he passed. This poem he not only heard, we were at a jazz concert and I saw him handing out sheets of paper to all his musician buddies. And I said, "What is that?" And he kind of blushed. It was this poem. When Bobby and Bobby made music together, he touched the strings. His bass fiddle responded to his touch like I do. The notes were gentle waves of his own sense of humor. She said fitting sounds back to him on the keys. Their music pleased and teased everyone, the way it played itself through their fingers. They communicated in unwritten jazz riffs, feeling the moment, filling the room with creative delight. None of it taped, just into the air, like a loving prayer.
Lovely.
This book, I met at Willowbridge a couple of years ago, met John Peterson, who sits beside me back there, and I said, "I write poetry, but I want to do a book of true stories, memoirs," asked if he'd be interested. So he said, "Well, let's see what you write like," and I gave him some of my stuff, this first book, the second book, and he took it on. And then I got the idea, I'd like to have a poem that belongs to each segment, to each prose piece. So I will read this poem that goes in front of a very short story. The poem, outside my window, lives a world new to me. We fill a feeder and birds feast each day. I sit beside it and they talk in trees. Can we trust this intruder who is not like us? I remember the bird on another patio. Whoa! I remember the bird on another patio who'd visit at lunchtime, us hospital employees. So safe was he'd eat from our hands. I sit on my patio while they talk in trees. They fly quickly by, faster than clouds. They touch perches and leave in a rush. Soon they will know they can trust this intruder who is not like us. And this is the very short story I put it with. I picked the shortest in the book. The temple where little girls worshipped. As far back as I can remember, I was enchanted by the precocious, talented, smiling personality of Shirley Temple. I had a blue cup made of glass which had her picture on it. I wouldn't drink my milk unless it was in my Shirley Temple cup. I was a pesky kid. Her picture was barely visible after the many times my mother had washed my special cup for me. But that didn't matter to me. It had to be that cup. A generation and a half later, it was with a mixture of feelings that I heard Shirley Temple Black would be visiting the auditorium of a company I worked for. After her talk, I went to meet her. Her right hand was bandaged. As I began to briefly mention my childhood devotion to her, I became more concerned about her in the present and asked what happened to her hand. She laughed and told me how a huge Texan had told her what a fan of hers he was as he crunched her small hand in his massive one. In his zeal, it must have taken very little to give her a spring. As she offered her left hand to me, it seemed very small and vulnerable to me in my not so large hand. I left the auditorium about what someone had done to her. It was innocent. It was out of enthusiasm for her as a personality. I doubt she would remember our brief meeting, but I'm sure she remembers him. And in closing, the first of my books, Your Face Tells Me. Your face tells me your beginnings, your memories, promises without a word. It is the imagery of your unwritten poem, your energy vibrating, the shimmering creation you have designed with your spirit and your mind. Thank you.